When American leaders say that another country is close to developing a nuclear weapon, what does that actually mean? Because if you go back through the last several decades and you trace the history of these warnings, you notice something that is genuinely strange. The United States has repeatedly told the public that some country, somewhere, is only a short time away from building a nuclear bomb. Sometimes the timeline is a few months. Sometimes it's a year. Sometimes they say it's right around the corner. And yet somehow the corner never arrives. The deadline keeps shifting. The clock keeps resetting. The threat keeps returning year after year in different forms, but with the same basic message. So the question I want us to sit with for a moment is this: why does that keep happening? Because here's the thing, if this were just a one-time mistake, you could explain it as bad intelligence or poor judgment. But this is not a one-time mistake. This is a pattern. And when you see a pattern that repeats itself across multiple decades, across multiple administrations, across multiple countries named as the threat, you have to start asking whether the pattern itself is doing something. In other words, what if the nuclear threat narrative isn't simply a reaction to real dangers in the world? What if it's actually serving a deeper strategic function? What if it's doing political work that goes far beyond any single country or any single crisis? That's the argument I want to make today. And the argument is this: the nuclear threat narrative is something that great powers reach for almost instinctively when they are facing structural challenges. It becomes a tool for maintaining political unity at home. It becomes a justification for military spending and expansion abroad. And it becomes a way of preserving the legitimacy of a global system that might otherwise be questioned. Now, I know that's a strong claim, and I'm not asking you to just accept it on faith. What I want to do is give you two ways of evaluating it. The first is through historical analysis, meaning we look at how empires in the past have behaved and ask whether they followed similar patterns. The second is through strategic logic, meaning we ask why rational political actors would choose to behave this way even when the actual threat is uncertain or exaggerated. So let's go through both of those, and then you can decide what you think. Let's start with history. And to really understand this pattern, we need to go back more than 2,000 years to a time when the most powerful civilization in the Western world was the Roman Republic. The year is roughly 200 BCE. Rome has just come through one of the most terrifying wars in its history, the Second Punic War against Carthage, where a general named Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants and nearly destroyed Rome itself. But Rome survived. Hannibal was eventually defeated. Carthage was weakened by the peace treaty, and for many years after that, Carthage posed very little real military threat to Rome. It was a diminished power. It was not rebuilding its army. It was not preparing for another war. But here is where it gets interesting. In Roman politics, something starts to happen. Roman leaders begin warning the public over and over again that Carthage is still dangerous, that Carthage is recovering its strength, that Carthage might one day threaten Rome again. And nobody did this more relentlessly than a Roman senator named Cato the Elder. Cato had a habit that became famous in ancient history. At the end of every single speech he gave in the Roman Senate, regardless of what the speech was actually about, he would finish with the same sentence. He would say, "Carthage must be destroyed." Didn't matter if the Senate was debating tax policy, agricultural reform, or trade disputes. Cato would end with the same words: Carthage must be destroyed, every single time. Now, why would a sophisticated Roman politician do something that seems almost absurdly repetitive? Because Cato understood something very deep about how politics works. He understood that fear is one of the most powerful forces in political life. That a society which feels threatened can be unified in ways that a society at peace cannot. That fear creates urgency. That urgency creates political will. And political will can be directed toward goals that would otherwise be impossible to achieve. Eventually, after years of this message being repeated, Rome launched the Third Punic War. And what happened to Carthage was total destruction. The city was burned to the ground, its population was killed or enslaved. The entire civilization was erased. Historians have debated for centuries whether Carthage at that point actually posed any real threat to Rome. Many of them conclude it did not. But it almost didn't matter, because once the Roman public was convinced that the threat was real, the political momentum became unstoppable. Now let's come forward about 2,000 years to 2003. The United States is preparing to invade Iraq. And the central argument being presented to the American public, to the United Nations, to the entire world is that Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear programs, chemical agents, biological weapons. The argument is that these weapons represent an imminent threat, that Iraq could use them or hand them to terrorist groups, and that therefore military action is not just justified, but necessary. The imagery is powerful, the language is urgent, and the political effect is enormous. Public support for the invasion builds. Congress votes to authorize the war. Coalition forces are assembled. And then the invasion happens. The country is occupied. And the weapons are never found. The programs that were described with such confidence and such detail simply did not exist in the form that had been presented. Now, there were genuinely complicated questions about how that happened. Was it a failure of intelligence? Was it deliberate manipulation? Was it the result of bureaucratic systems inside the security establishment that rewarded worst-case analysis? The honest answer is probably some combination of all of those things. But what matters most for our purposes is the political function that the nuclear threat narrative served. It created the conditions necessary for a massive military intervention that would otherwise have been almost impossible to justify. Without that narrative, without the specter of nuclear weapons, the political space for invading Iraq simply would not have existed. So we have ancient Rome using the threat of Carthage to justify the destruction of a weakened rival. We have the United States using the threat of Iraqi weapons programs to justify a major military intervention in the Middle East. And if you look beyond these two examples, you start to see the same pattern appearing again and again throughout the history of great powers. At a certain stage of development, empires begin to depend politically on the existence of external threats. Those threats justify military budgets that might otherwise seem excessive. They justify alliances that might otherwise seem unnecessary. They justify a global military presence that might otherwise be questioned by the domestic public. And once that system gets established, it becomes very hard for any individual leader to walk away from it, even if they wanted to. Okay, so that's the historical argument. Now let's think about the strategic logic, because I think this is where it really clicks into place. Imagine for a moment that you are the leader of a large global power. Your country has military bases and alliances spread across the world. Your economy is deeply connected to global trade routes and financial systems that you have spent decades building. Your political system includes powerful defense industries, intelligence agencies, and security institutions that employ millions of people and command enormous budgets. Now suppose that the domestic public starts to question all of this. Suppose ordinary people start asking whether the overseas military commitments are really necessary, whether the defense budget could be spent differently, whether the country's global role is actually making life better for people at home. At that point, you face a genuine political problem, because the entire structure of your global power depends on continued public support, and that support is starting to erode. So what do? One option is to explain the full complexity of international strategy, to walk people through the intricacies of alliance management, the logic of forward deterrence, the long-term calculations behind global military presence. But that is slow, it is difficult, and it requires a level of public patience and institutional trust that may not exist. The other option is much simpler and much more immediate. You find a threat, you make it vivid, you make it urgent. You make it something that people can understand without needing a degree in international relations. And nuclear weapons are absolutely perfect for this purpose, because nuclear weapons represent something that goes beyond ordinary danger. They represent civilizational destruction. Even the mere possibility that an adversary might acquire them is enough to generate profound fear. And fear, as political psychologists have shown repeatedly, is one of the most effective tools for overriding skepticism and building political consensus around action. From a pure game theory perspective, this makes the nuclear threat narrative a very rational strategic choice. It aligns public opinion with objectives that leaders have already decided to pursue. It reduces resistance to military spending. It reinforces the legitimacy of a global security system that benefits powerful institutional actors. And critically, it raises the political cost of dissent, because anyone who questions the narrative can be dismissed as dangerously naive or strategically irresponsible. That dynamic alone is enormously powerful, because it doesn't just silence critics, It makes criticism seem like a form of recklessness. And once this process gets going, it tends to sustain itself. Intelligence agencies develop institutional incentives to find evidence that confirms a threat rather than evidence that challenges it. Politicians repeat the warnings because repeating them is politically safe, while questioning them is politically risky. Media organizations amplify the message because urgency and danger drive attention. And over time, the narrative becomes so deeply embedded in public consciousness that it starts to feel like simple common sense rather than a constructed political position. So when we come back to that original question, why do nuclear threat narratives appear so consistently and so repeatedly in the politics of great powers? The answer isn't simply that leaders are making mistakes or that intelligence is imperfect. The answer is structural. Empires need justification for their global role. Nuclear threats provide that justification in its most concentrated and emotionally powerful form. The pattern isn't accidental. It follows from the incentives built into the political systems of great powers. Now, historians looking back at this moment will probably ask whether this pattern can continue indefinitely. Because history also shows that when threat narratives become too disconnected from reality, they create serious problems of their own. They encourage overreach. They trap empires in expensive conflicts that drain resources and erode the foundations of power over time. Rome's endless wars eventually hollowed out the Republic. 2 decades of conflict in the Middle East left the United States more politically divided and strategically exhausted than before. The tool that seemed so useful in the short term can become a kind of trap in the long term. So next time you hear that some country is only months away from a nuclear weapon, I'm not telling you to assume the threat is false. Sometimes threats are real. But I am suggesting that understanding the political function of that narrative, understanding why it exists and what work it is doing, is absolutely essential to making sense of how great powers actually behave in the world. The nuclear clock that keeps resetting is not just a story about bombs. It's a story about power, about fear, and about the political systems that depend on both.